Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the silk-draped corridors of the ancient Persian court, where incense curls through the air, sandals whisper against marble, and secrets pass faster than messengers. You're surrounded by gold, by silence, by people who smile without meaning it. And in the corner, under a lattice screen, someone is watching. Small, still, beautiful, and entirely underestimated. You're about to meet Bagoas. Now, listen. If you think this is going to be an action story about armies and flaming siege towers, you're going to be so gently disappointed. This is not that kind of Alexander tale. This is the slow one, the quiet one, the one that almost slipped between the scrolls. And yes, you probably won't survive this if you were a jealous Macedonian general back then. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment with your city and what time you're listening. I love seeing how far these sleepy stories go. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Alexander didn't plan on meeting Bagoas. Then again, Alexander didn't plan on conquering the entire known world before the age of 32 either. But that's how things go when you have ambition, a pointy haircut, and a tendency to name cities after yourself. It happens in Babylon. The city has just fallen, or more precisely, it has surrendered, which is Babylon's version of giving someone cake instead of arrows. Alexander walks through the city gates in 331 BCE, and the streets bloom with petals. Musicians play music they think sounds Greek, and someone hands him an actual golden chair to sit on. You know, casual Tuesday. But it's not the gifts or the fanfare that catch Alexander's attention. It's the Persian court. The people Darius left behind, specifically the quiet ones, the ones who didn't run. There, in the corner of a palace room that smells like cardamom and crushed roses, Alexander sees him. Bagoas isn't grand. He's not in armor. He doesn't bow too low or speak too much. He's 17, maybe 18, with those unreadable dark eyes and the kind of presence that makes a room feel like it's paying attention to itself. The folds of his robe are immaculate, and his hands rest lightly in his lap like he's listening to music no one else hears. One Macedonian general calls him a pretty ghost. Another calls him a problem. Alexander? He doesn't call him anything. Not yet. But that night, over honey wine and soft harp music, the king asks one of the Persian administrators, "Who's the one who doesn't flinch when I look his way?" The administrator coughs politely. "Ah, that is Bagoas, your majesty. He belonged to Darius." Ah, belonged. Here we come to the delicate part. Bagoas, you see, was a eunuch, castrated as a boy and raised in the Persian court as part servant, part ornament, part trusted companion. In the Achaemenid Empire, eunuchs were often close to the royal family, trained in languages, etiquette, diplomacy, and sometimes assassination. Imagine being elegant and terrifying all at once. But Bagoas is not terrifying, not yet. He's just there. Watching, listening. And in Alexander's tent that evening, amid maps and military dice, the young king keeps remembering that quiet face behind the incense. Historians still argue whether this first meeting held any real emotion, or if it was purely curiosity. Some think Bagoas was assigned to Alexander as a peace offering. Others believe Alexander asked for him specifically. One dusty scroll hints that Alexander saw in Bagoas the perfection of silence, whatever that means. What we know? The next morning, Bagoas is gone from the palace. He's in the Macedonian camp, in the tent next to Alexander's, and he never leaves again. The early days are a swirl of uncertainty. Macedonian soldiers don't trust Persian courtiers, and they definitely don't trust delicate ones who wear perfume and speak in careful syllables. One officer swears Bagoas poisoned the wine at a banquet. Another accuses him of eavesdropping on war councils. But every time someone complains, Alexander gives them the same look, the "you can be replaced by a goat" look. You don't survive under Alexander by questioning who's allowed to sit near him. And Bagoas doesn't speak out. He doesn't need to. Instead, he moves like mist between places, delivering scrolls, remembering names, adjusting the drapes in the king's tent so that the sun never touches his maps at the wrong angle. He never draws attention, and yet, everything moves more smoothly when he's around. Even the king seems calmer, or at least less likely to throw daggers at pillars. One night, Alexander wakes from a dream with a start, the kind of dream that makes your mouth dry and your hands shake. A Persian priest had whispered to him days before, "You will meet the ghost of your fate before you recognize its name." He sits up, chest rising and falling, and Bagoas, already awake, is sitting quietly nearby. Not watching, just waiting. The king doesn't speak, neither does he. But something shifts between them. Something soft, not yet spoken, but no longer unseen. You know the smell of a royal tent? Probably not. But if you were to drift through Alexander's personal quarters sometime around 330 BCE, you'd get a strange little mix. Worn leather, scroll glue, sandalwood-oiled figs, and the faintest whisper of something floral, probably coming from Bagoas. He doesn't make noise when he walks. Macedonian soldiers joke that he might actually be part shadow, or that he glides instead of steps. But one thing is certain, when Bagoas enters a room, people behave just a little better. They sit straighter. They finish their sentences. They make sure they're not the loudest one speaking. This is not because Bagoas threatens anyone. Oh no, he doesn't need to. His presence is enough. Like a candle that makes you think of home, but also of fire. By now, Bagoas has grown familiar with the rhythm of Alexander's world. Mornings begin with the king reading letters from half the known world, governors whining about grain, philosophers debating with themselves, and the occasional note from his mother Olympias telling him to stop being reckless and eat more lentils. Classic mom. And beside him, there's Bagoas. Never in the way, never absent. He pours wine into the correct cup. He unrolls maps before Alexander gestures. He knows which advisors the king will tolerate before breakfast, only Ptolemy, never Craterus, and which dogs are allowed to sleep by the tent flap. Bagoas becomes part of the furniture, but with eyes. There's a moment sometime during their second month together when Bagoas smiles. Not the polite court smile, a real one. A half-tilted private thing, like a joke only he heard. It's during a game. Alexander's generals are off duty, tossing knucklebones, dice made from goat joints, trying to best each other in a kind of ancient gambling meets storytelling ritual. Alexander is watching with mild interest, and Bagoas is refilling his wine when someone asks, "So, how much would you wager on your pretty shadow here?" The tent goes quiet. The speaker is Cletus the Black, a loud, often drunk, deeply loyal general who once saved Alexander's life. Facts he mentions approximately every 27 minutes. Alexander blinks once. He doesn't rise to it. But Bagoas? He smirks. Just once. Just slightly. And Cletus, confused, slightly embarrassed, fumbles with his cup and grumbles something about Persians and how they're all born with secrets under their tongues. It's the first time Bagoas ever seems dangerous. The Macedonians start to wonder. Maybe this isn't just an ornament. Maybe this is someone Alexander trusts too much. You see, Bagoas wasn't raised to take up space. He was trained to shape it. He knows that power doesn't always sit on a throne. Sometimes it leans against a post and listens more than it speaks. In the Persian court, he was taught the art of presence, how to walk exactly 2 steps behind a ruler, how to say no with a head tilt, and how to gather more intelligence in a bathhouse than most spies could with a sword. There's a story, possibly apocryphal, but charming, about Bagoas helping Alexander select a robe for an audience with Babylonian astronomers. Not because the king cared about fashion, but because certain colors offended the stars. Alexander was about to wear black. Bagoas politely replaced it with deep violet. The stars, evidently, were pleased. The meeting went well. Historians still argue whether Bagoas ever gave military advice, or if his influence was purely social. But records suggest that his opinion was asked more often than you'd expect. For someone officially ranked as attendant, he was oddly present in matters of law, religion, and morale. And let's talk about perfume for a second. Bagoas wore it. Every day. A subtle blend of myrrh and violet root, rubbed into the cuffs of his sleeves and behind his ears. Macedonians thought it odd, even effeminate. But Alexander leaned closer. There's a sweet little anecdote from an officer's travel log. The king once passed me without seeing, but he smelled of violets and sandalwood, and I knew the Persian had been near. Then comes the play. The army stops in a small city near Susa for rest. The officers arrange a night of entertainment, a Greek tragedy about Thetis, the sea nymph mother of Achilles. Alexander loves anything related to Achilles. He probably sees himself as Achilles, if Achilles had a fan club and a better tailor. But here's the twist. For one of the traditional dance interludes, the organizers convince Bagoas to perform. They think it'll be amusing, exotic, maybe even embarrassing. It's not. When Bagoas takes the stage, barefoot, arms outstretched, layered in blue silk, the whole camp goes still. He moves like he's underwater, each gesture smooth and deliberate, telling some ancient story without words. Even the horses stop chewing. Alexander doesn't blink. When Bagoas finishes, there's a beat of silence, and then, not from the crowd but from Alexander himself, a single, slow clap. Then another. The whole tent erupts in applause. But the king, he doesn't cheer. He stands, quietly walks to Bagoas, and kisses him on the cheek. Just once. This moment, tiny and ceremonial, becomes the stuff of gossip. The Persians love it. The Macedonians tolerate it. The generals grit their teeth. But Alexander doesn't care. Later that night, when the tent is cleared and only soft lamplight remains, Bagoas sits beside the king and says, "You shouldn't have done that." Alexander looks at him. "Why not?" "Because now they'll look at me." Alexander smiles. "Let them." And for the first time, Bagoas allows himself to lean just slightly, just enough to feel the warmth of the man who had, just months ago, been a stranger with a sword. He falls asleep there, and no one wakes him. In the world of Persian diplomacy, a gift was never just a gift. It was a message, a symbol, sometimes even a dare wrapped in ribbon. So when Alexander began receiving presents from the territories that once belonged to Darius III, each package came with an invisible scroll that read, "Please don't burn down our city next." There were golden bowls, ivory chess sets, trained parrots that could recite Greek greetings. One city even sent a taxidermied lion, which was a bold choice, because it turns out Alexander much preferred them alive and roaring. But then came a strange offering from a satrap, one of the Persian regional governors, nervous about his position and desperate to win favor. He sent a procession of entertainers and dancers, trays of sweets sculpted into camels, and at the center of it all, a boy. Well, a young man. Delicate, adorned, silent, and alive. Not just alive, but specifically instructed not to speak unless spoken to. A living gift, they called it. That young man? Bagoas. The details of how Bagoas came into Darius's service are murky, whispered, and more often than not softened by time. Some say he was taken from a noble family and given as tribute. Others say he was purchased, groomed, educated, not for love, not for labor, but for presentation. Like a statue that could walk and smile. Historians still argue whether Bagoas had any real agency at this point, or if his entire life up to Alexander had been crafted by other men's desires. But there's one thread that keeps emerging from the fog of speculation. He survived, quietly, sharply, elegantly. When Bagoas was first delivered to Alexander, he was expected to act like a mirror, reflect light, be pleasing, be silent. Instead, he listened, and Alexander noticed. The satrap who sent Bagoas as a gift made a grave miscalculation. He thought the young conqueror was just like Darius, a man easily distracted by beauty and flattery. But Alexander wasn't interested in playthings, or rather not just in playthings. He asked Bagoas questions. Not many, and not immediately, but small ones. Where he was from, what dialects he spoke, what music he preferred. Bagoas answered calmly, with a tone that didn't seek to impress, only to inform. He didn't flutter his lashes. He didn't lower his gaze too long. He wasn't coy, which, ironically, made him far more intriguing. Alexander once told Hephaestion, "He moves like a lie that hasn't been caught yet." To which Hephaestion replied, "And you look at him like you want to be the one who finds it." Zing. Now, this part of the story starts to squirm, because historians are very fidgety about relationships between famous dead people and their not-as-famous companions. Was Bagoas Alexander's lover? His confidant? A trusted servant? All of the above? None? What we do know is this. Bagoas was never sent away. And when Alexander began moving again, onward to Susa, toward India, and further into the dry lands where maps turned to guesses, Bagoas went too. Not as cargo, not as baggage, as part of the circle. He even rode his own horse, a small, well-kept one with a bronze nose guard. But this is where things start to feel uncomfortable. Not because of anything graphic, but because of the implications. A living gift. That phrase kept echoing through the Macedonian ranks. Some mocked it, others feared it. One general asked after too much wine, when did kings start unwrapping people instead of presents? It wasn't fair to Bagoas, but fairness wasn't currency in Alexander's world. Favor was. And Bagoas had it. He was there in the tent when Alexander dictated letters to his mother. He was there when Greek philosophers debated ethics over roasted lamb. He was even trusted to carry messages to allied satraps, something not even all the Macedonian commanders were allowed to do. One story says that during a brief siege, when Alexander was wounded in the side, it was Bagoas who held the bowl of wine he used to sterilize the cut. A soft hand, a steady hand, a hand that didn't tremble, even as the king swore in ancient Macedonian, a language that mostly sounds like angry goats. Alexander looked up at him, blood on his side, and said, "You don't turn away." And Bagoas replied, "I've never needed to." This earned him enemies. Some officers muttered that Bagoas was replacing Hephaestion, Alexander's longtime companion and closest friend. Others believed he was whispering policy into the king's ear, turning him Persian from the inside out. But Bagoas didn't argue. He just kept being present. And that made him dangerous. At a feast in Persepolis, a group of senior soldiers tried to provoke him. They placed a jug of wine beside his seat, but swapped the label, strong stuff, usually reserved for ceremonial flame offerings. The idea? He'd sip it, choke, and embarrass himself. Bagoas didn't touch it. Instead, when Alexander raised his cup to toast those who knew their enemies by scent, Bagoas leaned in and murmured, "This one smells of pine and fear." The king laughed so hard he spilled his drink. The prank collapsed. The generals sulked. And Bagoas, politely, excused himself with a nod. There's a statue, long lost, maybe apocryphal, said to have once stood in a garden near Babylon. It depicted a young man, eyes closed, holding a scroll in one hand and a rose in the other. Locals called it the Listener. Some say it was Bagoas. Others say it was just art. But if it was him, the symbolism fits. Because Bagoas, gifted and silent, had become something unexpected. Not a possession, not a shadow, but a choice. Alexander kept him close not because he had to, but because he wanted to. And in a world where everything, cities, armies, even love, was taken by force, that quiet decision meant more than 1,000 battles. The night before the Battle of Gaugamela smells like dust and worry. Alexander's army camps beneath a sky so wide it looks like it might swallow the stars. Somewhere out in the darkness, tens of thousands of Persian troops wait. Spears upright like a field of silver grass, war elephants shifting nervously in the heat. Inside Alexander's tent, it's quiet. No messengers, no maps, just the steady flicker of oil lamps and the occasional sigh of canvas shifting in the breeze. You're there, just outside the circle of lamplight. You see Bagoas, kneeling, folding a robe, adjusting a strap on a leather saddlebag, moving as if the next morning won't bring chaos and screams and horses foaming at the mouth. And you notice something odd. He's humming. This is the part of the story where everything could tip. The Battle of Gaugamela, 331 BCE, is the moment Alexander bets everything. His reputation, his army, his dream of owning not just land, but legacy. Darius III is back, and this time he's angry. He has more troops, better ground, chariots with blades on their wheels. You read that right, ancient Roombas of doom. Most generals would lose sleep. Most kings would pray. Alexander, he sleeps soundly, because as one historian noted with sleepy sarcasm, he was either brave beyond reason or simply unreasonable. But before he sleeps, he asks Bagoas to stay, not to speak, just to be near. That night, as the camp dims and the fire pits burn down to whispers, Bagoas sits beside Alexander's cot, unrolling a small scroll. It's not military strategy. It's not correspondence. It's poetry. Old Persian verses from the court of Cyrus the Great, soft metaphors about wind and waiting and water that never forgets the shape of the cup. He doesn't read it aloud. He just traces the lines with his eyes. And when Alexander wakes, just before dawn, as the first cries of the watchmen rise, he sees Bagoas sitting there, eyes closed, still holding the scroll. "You didn't sleep," he murmurs. "I wasn't tired." There's a myth that Bagoas tied a charm onto Alexander's armor strap that morning. A tiny ring of bronze carved with the figure of a winged lion. Some say it was a Persian symbol of protection. Others say it was just a lucky trinket from an old courtier's box. Either way, Alexander wore it. And when he rode into battle, his cloak billowing like a comet, he carried that charm close to his heart. The Battle of Gaugamela is long, brutal, dusty. At one point, Darius flees. Again. And Alexander, always the overachiever, almost dies chasing him, charging through enemy lines with such ridiculous confidence that even his bodyguards can't keep up. But he doesn't die. He He survives because of tactics, because of training, and maybe, just maybe, because of that little charm. When he returns to camp, dirty and victorious, the soldiers shout his name. Someone throws rose petals, another tries to kiss his horse. Everyone's drunk on adrenaline and victory. And in the back, quietly as always, stands Bagoas. Not with the dancers, not with the courtiers, just waiting. Alexander sees him, and here's the part that gets recorded, sort of sideways, by a Greek historian who apparently had no time for subtlety. The king, dusty and bloodied, embraced the Persian before all the men, and kissed him as one kisses home after long absence. Boom. Gossip cannon. Fired. The tent that night is louder than usual. Generals celebrating. Music. A roast boar someone dragged out of nowhere. But amid the clamor, Alexander sits near the tent's edge, his head resting against a rolled-up cloak. And Bagoas, in a moment of something like daring, sits beside him. Not behind, not beside a post, but beside. You should be proud, he says. Alexander nods. They fought like they believed in something. And you? Bagoas asks. I believe in what comes next. It's a strange relationship, this. Not built on candlelit confessions or epic declarations, but on silences, on glances, on trust forged in the heat of battles and the hush of evening scrolls. Historians still argue whether it was love or convenience or some fusion of companionship and politics. But remember this, Alexander wasn't known for keeping things. He moved fast, burned hot, named cities after himself, and then never visited them again. But Bagoas, he stayed, and that says something. There's a moment after the battle that gets almost no attention in textbooks. A Macedonian scout returns with a Persian robe, torn, dusty, but edged with gold thread. He offers it to Alexander, thinking it might have belonged to Darius. Alexander shakes his head. Give it to him, he says, nodding toward Bagoas. The scout hesitates. He was yours. The scout says quietly. Is it right to dress a servant in a king's robe? Alexander looks up, expression unreadable. Only if you think he's just a servant. The scout doesn't speak again. That night, Bagoas wears the robe, not with pride, not with mockery, just as clothing. And when he sits beside the man who'd just broken the Persian Empire in half, he doesn't speak about Darius, or the robe, or what the future might hold. He just says, "You smell like horses and old wine." Alexander laughs, and the stars, as usual, pretend not to listen. There's something funny about how people talk about kings. They remember the battles, the speeches, the glorious stomping across continents. But they often forget the awkward banquets, the ones with mismatched goblets and too many olives, and the awkward clink of forks when no one wants to mention the elephant in the room. Literally, because Alexander had a few of those by now. Susa was one of those banquets. The year is 324 BCE. Alexander has taken the Persian capital of Susa, one of the last truly glittering jewels of the Achaemenid crown, and instead of torching it or turning it into yet another city named after himself, Alexandropolis, Alexandria town, he decides to do something much weirder. He throws a mass wedding. Here's the setup. Alexander, still fully committed to the idea of blending cultures and annoying his generals, marries 2 Persian noblewomen in one night. Meanwhile, he orders 80 of his top officers to do the same with Persian brides. Some of them cry, some of them drink until they can't cry, one pretends to faint. But the message is clear. You're not just here to conquer, you're here to stay. Now, in the middle of this silk and saffron fever dream of a wedding banquet, there's a performance. And not just any performance, a private one. Bagoas dances, not for the crowd, not for the nobles, just for Alexander. He enters from the side of the great hall, barefoot, clad in white robes that shift like moonlight on water. The musicians hush. Even the elephants outside seem to stop chewing. And then slowly he begins to move. It's not the wild, showy kind of dancing you'd see at a wine-soaked Macedonian festival. It's deliberate, controlled, graceful in a way that feels both ancient and new. He turns like a whisper. He raises his arms like he's conducting wind. His wrists ripple like language no one speaks anymore. Alexander watches, unmoving, unblinking. And when the music ends, when the last finger settles like a feather falling onto a table, the entire room exhales. Now here's the part that gets messy. One of the Macedonian officers, probably tipsy, probably bitter about marrying a woman whose name he can't pronounce, calls out, "Shall we all bow to your dancer now too?" And that's when Alexander does something no one expects. He stands, walks through the silence, takes Bagoas' hand, and kisses him, not on the cheek, but on the lips. The air in the banquet hall changes. Persians beam, some clap gently. Macedonians freeze like statues caught doing something embarrassing. Some cough, one spills wine, another mutters something under his breath that sounds suspiciously like, "We marched through deserts for this?" But Alexander doesn't care. He simply says, "He has danced better than any of you have fought," and sits back down. Bagoas, ever unreadable, returns to his place, head high, steps slow. That kiss, by the way, it's not fiction. Plutarch, the gossip-loving ancient biographer, records it in his writings. Of course, Plutarch also believed that lightning struck Alexander's cradle as a baby, so grain of salt. From that day on, Bagoas isn't just a shadow in the corner. He's a symbol. To the Persians, he's hope, that Alexander sees their customs not as relics but as treasures. To the Macedonians, he's a threat, that Alexander might be slipping, loving too deeply the very world they conquered. And to Alexander, Bagoas is still just Bagoas. He doesn't crown him, doesn't give him land, but he gives him place. And in a world where names are currency and lineage is everything, that quiet act of belonging might be the most radical gesture of all. The backlash, of course, comes quickly. One general, Coenus, refuses to eat at the same table as the perfumed ones. Another writes home to his wife, saying, "The king's bed is warmer than ours, but not because of blankets." Subtle. Even Hephaestion, Alexander's oldest companion, and maybe former lover, maybe still, grows tense. There's a night where the three of them are in the tent together, Alexander, Bagoas, and Hephaestion, and no one speaks for a full hour. The tension could butter a loaf of Persian flatbread. But nothing explodes. Alexander simply leaves first. Hephaestion follows, and Bagoas stays. Later, when someone asks Bagoas how he endures the stares, the whispers, the politics, he gives the most Bagoas answer imaginable. "I was trained to serve a king." And then, after a pause, "But I never said which one." There's a scene, not recorded in any scroll, but whispered by a court musician years later, that Bagoas once brought Alexander a bowl of dates one morning. Simple, no ceremony, just fruit, sun-warmed and soft. Alexander, still groggy from wine, looked at him and said, "Do you know what I envy most about you?" Bagoas blinked. "That I don't have to hold court?" "No," Alexander said, "that you know how to be quiet and still be heard." Bagoas smiled. "That's just perfume." But it wasn't. By now, they are more than king and companion. They are mirror and flame, and the world, burning at its edges, keeps spinning around them. There's a rule in every army: never let things get too quiet, because that's when trouble sneaks in, between meals, during heat waves, or around the time someone starts counting how many people the king seems to like more than his generals. In Alexander's camp, after Susa, things get very quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that tastes like jealousy and smells like roasted goat. Bagoas has now been with Alexander for years. He knows which boots squeak. He knows which general always lies about how far they've marched. He even knows how to fold the royal cloak so the clasp doesn't pinch Alexander's collarbone. That's a very specific skill. But more importantly, Bagoas knows what not to say, especially when the others start talking. They always talk. Let's set the scene. Another dusty afternoon somewhere east of Babylon. The heat presses down like an unwelcome blanket, and the soldiers, bored and sunburnt, are playing a game involving pebbles, bad songs, and entirely too much wine. Bagoas, as usual, keeps to the shadows. He's delivering figs, folding parchment, probably adjusting the position of a cushion by half an inch, because he always notices when the king's back tenses just slightly. And across the tent, a few of the generals are grumbling again. "You ever wonder," one mutters, "if the king listens more to that dancer than to his own commanders?" Another replies, "He listens to that dancer more than he listens to me, and I once pulled an arrow out of his leg." A third chuckles, "Maybe we should start wearing perfume." Cue laughter. Not kind laughter, the kind that folds up sharp and pokes. This isn't new. Ever since the kiss in Susa, Bagoas has been treated less like a novelty and more like a political presence. He doesn't give orders, he doesn't wear armor, but people are afraid of what he could whisper, if he chose. The thing is, he doesn't. Bagoas doesn't make power plays, he makes tea, and that might be even more unnerving. There's one night when the grumbling turns into something more. At a private banquet, small, informal, full of commanders too drunk to notice they're chewing too loudly, someone dares Bagoas to pour wine the way real Persians do. Now this is a trap, because real Persian court pouring involves specific posture, eye contact, exact arm angles, and sometimes poetry. The goal? Humiliate him. Make him flinch, make him seem less. Bagoas picks up the jug and proceeds to pour with such flawless form, shoulder back, wrist arched, neck inclined, that the room actually goes quiet. Again, he finishes with a verse. The moon bows not to the sun, yet still shares its light, and places the cup gently in front of the stunned general who dared him. Alexander smiles. That general doesn't speak for the rest of the night. Now you may be wondering, did Alexander ever step in? Ever defend him? Yes and no. Alexander's style wasn't defense, it was preference. He didn't shout down the gossip, he just ignored it. He didn't order silence. He gave Bagoas the seat nearest the brazier when nights turned cold. When a feast was thrown in honor of a small but vital river victory, Alexander gave the first toast, not to a general, but to the one who brought him a clean robe and calm before every campaign. To the one, he said, lifting his cup, who prepares peace even as we prepare war. A few soldiers blinked confused. One officer muttered, "We're all going to die in India, aren't we?" Yes, you probably are. Let's talk about the bowl of dates. This is the kind of story that seems too small for history, but too sharp to be forgotten. One evening, Alexander is too tired to eat. The camp is tense. Supplies are thin. One of the elephants accidentally flattened a cart full of grain. Morale is lower than a snake in sandals. Bagoas walks in, no speech, no music, just a bowl. Inside, fresh dates, slightly warm, probably stolen from the officer's quartermaster who never labels anything correctly anyway. He sets it down, leaves. Alexander doesn't touch the bowl for hours. Then, after midnight, he eats one. Just one. The next morning he wakes up with a plan. March before dawn, catch the rebels before they regroup, and carry the river. The plan works. And somewhere between throwing open the tent flap and barking orders, Alexander pauses, turns to a scribe, and says, "Make sure the quartermaster gets more dates." Historians still argue whether Bagoas ever commanded anything directly, but it's undeniable that he became part of the rhythm, the decisions made in half whispers, the quiet influence, the moments that tip the scale without fanfare. You could call it soft power. You could also call it companionship. One time, in a rare moment of mischief, Bagoas hides one of Alexander's scrolls, the one full of letters from a cranky philosopher back in Athens who always ends his notes with, "You've clearly forgotten virtue." Alexander finds the scroll wedged in a fruit basket. He laughs. Bagoas just shrugs. "I thought the grapes were more virtuous." Still, not everyone finds Bagoas amusing. Craterus, one of Alexander's most old-school, beard-thumping generals, once declares loudly that the army is not a place for dancers or decorators. Alexander responds evenly, "Then I trust you'll be decorating our next conquest personally." Burn. Craterus does not mention Bagoas again. At this point, Bagoas is no longer just a footnote in a king's story. He's part of it. He's survived court politics, war marches, whispers, and feasts. He's seen Alexander at his highest and his dustiest. And through it all, he's never asked for anything more than a quiet place to sit, a robe that fits, and occasionally a bowl of warm dates. Sometimes, that's how history is made. Not with a sword, but with silence. They say the road east never ends. That once you cross into the lands beyond Persia, into the jagged spine of Bactria and the humid plains that edge toward India, you stop seeing the horizon and start chasing it. Alexander did just that, and Bagoas followed. Now picture it. Dust curling off horse hooves, sweat clinging to armor, the endless whine of flies, and Alexander riding ahead like a man who's sprinting toward destiny and refuses to stop for a snack. They climb mountains so steep that even the goats look tired. They ford rivers that try to eat their horses. They fight in monsoons, in heat waves, in forests so thick the sun disappears. And through all of it, between the tents and the scrolls and the unspoken commands, there's Bagoas, dressed in lighter robes now, his sandals worn smooth, a pack always ready, and his gaze as calm as ever. This leg of the journey changes everything. It's not just war anymore. It's something more, something half exploration, half obsession. Alexander begins to blur the lines between conqueror and mystic. He starts holding rituals in languages even he doesn't fully understand. He meets Brahmins, asks questions about reincarnation, tries fasting, badly, and has a very intense dream about a snake that might have been symbolic or might have just been a snake. Historians still argue whether Alexander truly sought enlightenment, or if he was just very, very sleep-deprived. Either way, his mood changes. He grows quieter, more unpredictable. And Bagoas? He adapts. There's a story, a strange one, even by ancient standards. Somewhere deep in the jungles of what's now Pakistan, Alexander is given a small stone statue. It's faceless, smooth, weighty, supposedly sacred. The local priests say it grants wisdom to those who listen to it. Alexander tries meditating with it. For 3 days, nothing happens. Then one evening, Bagoas picks up the statue and simply says, maybe it only speaks to those who don't ask questions. Alexander laughs for the first time in weeks. Not everything is mystical, though. There's the very real, very human problem of tired soldiers. By now, the Macedonians are exhausted. Their boots have outlived their feet. Their weapons are rusting from jungle humidity. And they're starting to whisper the one word no king wants to hear: return. One afternoon, after a grueling march, Alexander gathers his officers under a canopy of low trees. He asks them, "Would you follow me further?" There's silence. A long, uncomfortable, shoe-scuffing kind of silence. Then a voice from the back says, "We would follow you home." Oof. Even Alexander can't argue with that. He dismisses the council and walks back to camp alone, except, of course, for Bagoas. They don't speak at first. Then Alexander mutters, "Do you think I've asked too much?" And Bagoas, carefully not looking at him, replies, "Only from those who didn't expect so much." Alexander stops walking, says nothing, and then, very quietly, says, "You expected it? I expected more." There's another myth, probably invented by a bored soldier or a poetic scribe, but still, they say Bagoas once braided a strand of Alexander's hair with a red thread during a night when thunder chased them through the hills. The next morning, the storm broke, and the path ahead was clear. Symbolic? Sure. True? Who knows? But someone carved a red thread onto a rock near the river. It's still there, apparently. Let's talk about the elephants. Oh yes, the famous war elephants of India. Huge, unpredictable, often drunk on fermented fruit, not a joke. They were the tanks of the ancient world. When Alexander faces them in battle, even he hesitates. But not Bagoas. While the army's quartermasters are panicking and the war dogs are barking and the generals are shouting, Bagoas is calmly studying the elephants. Not their tusks, their handlers. He notices they whisper before a charge, that they tap certain patterns on the animal's flanks. He writes it all down on a wax tablet. Later, Alexander uses those notes. The elephants flinch and the Macedonians win. Of course, Bagoas isn't credited, not officially, but Alexander walks past him that evening and says only this: "I knew I kept you around for a reason." To which Bagoas replies, "And here I thought it was for my company." Alexander grins. And for a moment, the war seems very far away, but the pressure is building. Hephaestion, Alexander's closest companion, now a high-ranking commander, is growing colder. He doesn't smile when Bagoas enters the tent, doesn't stay behind when the king lingers. Their shared past, whatever it was, is cracking under the strain of distance, of time, and of quiet rivalry. One night, Hephaestion leaves the camp abruptly. No warning. Alexander says nothing, but Bagoas notices the wine remains untouched that evening, and the maps stay rolled. The campaign rolls forward, but something has shifted. Alexander wins battles, he gains territory, but he loses stillness. His dreams become restless, he wakes often, and Bagoas, once the silent presence, begins sitting closer, not to intrude, just to anchor. He lights the lamps, refolds the robes, replaces the dried herbs that ward off insects. And when Alexander sighs in his sleep, Bagoas sometimes hums under his breath, low, wordless, like the sound of home. In the thick jungles of the east, far from Babylon and the perfume of palaces, Bagoas no longer wears silk. But somehow he seems more royal than ever, not because of what he owns, but because of what he knows and what he carries. Not just scrolls, but memory, and something like love, even if no one dares call it that out loud. The return to Babylon was not a triumph. Oh, there were trumpets. Of course, banners, petals tossed from balconies by people who had practiced their cheering in front of polished bowls. But something about it all rang hollow, like a song sung one note off. Alexander was tired. Not the kind of tired you fix with sleep, but the kind that seeps into the bones and unbuttons the soul. And Bagoas, always quiet, always present, watched it happen. The king of the world now walked with a limp. Nothing dramatic, just a hesitation in the left foot, a reminder of a wound no one could quite agree on. A spear from India? A fever from Egypt? A dream too sharp to shake? Historians still argue whether Alexander was ill from the start, or whether Babylon, that haunted old city of old gods and even older grudges, got under his skin. But either way, the king, this man who once raced the sun across continents, was slowing. And Bagoas stayed close. The palace at Babylon was full of strange sounds, whispering reeds in the gardens, servants practicing laughter, priests who claimed to read omens in pigeon feathers and oil slicks. Bagoas walked those halls with soft steps and sharp ears. He saw how Alexander's smile no longer reached his eyes, how his appetite shrank, how he spoke more often to himself than to others. One night, Alexander looked up from a map, one of India, one he'd never use again, and asked, "Do you think I did enough?" Bagoas didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked to the window, lifted the curtain, let the night air spill in like cool wine, and then said, "I think you did too much." Alexander laughed, a small, dry sound. Then he whispered, "So why does it still feel unfinished?" In those final weeks, Alexander made strange plans. He spoke of sailing to Arabia, of building floating cities, of turning deserts into gardens. He issued orders for more temples, more cities, more, everything. But the scribes could barely keep up. His handwriting became a tangle, his voice a hush, his posture curved. And Bagoas, still folding robes, still arranging cushions, still watching, began to prepare. Not with fanfare, but with care. A quieter tone to his voice, a gentler brush of the comb through Alexander's hair. A silence that said, "I know, I'm here." Hephaestion had died the year before, and though Alexander never said it aloud, part of him had never left the pyre. Bagoas had been there. He had poured the oil. He had stepped back, unseen. And now, as Alexander began to flicker like a torch in the wind, Bagoas understood. This, too, would be quiet. This would not be a death with horns and poetry. It would be a soft undoing. There's a story, half dream, half legend, that in his final hours, Alexander turned to Bagoas and asked for no scrolls, no generals, no priest. Only water, and someone to sit with. Bagoas brought both. The moment of passing is not recorded. Not exactly. The official record, written in stiff syllables by men with too many rings, says Alexander died on the 10th or 11th of June, 323 BCE. But Bagoas, if he were asked, might say it happened in a breath. Not with thunder, but with stillness. Like a candle deciding finally that it has seen enough. In the days that followed, the palace turned brittle. Generals fought over succession. Servants packed their things. Cities waited. But Bagoas remained. He dressed the body, laid the old threadbare cloak over the cot one last time, folded the maps, blew out the lamps, and walked the halls alone. Some say he vanished after that he returned to Persia, took a new name, lived in a garden of pomegranates in silence. Others believe he followed the funeral cart, disguised, grieving, guarding. No one really knows. But in one version of the tale, written in a margin by a bored scribe decades later, there's a final note. And with him went the last voice who spoke not to the king, but to the boy beneath the crown. So now, here we are. The torches are low, the tent has gone quiet, the sand outside rests in little drifts, waiting for the first sleepy stirrings of dawn. You followed the journey, from palaces to riverbanks, through battles and banquets, through silk robes and quiet dances, through maps drawn in dust and dreams spoken in half whispers. And Bagoas? Still with us. Not as a relic, not even as a memory, but as something softer, an echo in the folds of history. The kind of presence that lingers not because it shouted, but because it stayed. He never wrote scrolls, he never led armies, but he saw Alexander, not just as the great, not just as the conqueror, but as the man who got cold at night, who doubted himself, who asked for water and a quiet song when the stars leaned low. That's the strange magic of history, isn't it? We remember kings for their crowns, but sometimes it's the ones who stood beside them. The ones who listened, who endured, who waited. That shaped the stories that last. So let this story settle with you now. Let the sand cool. Let the stars blink above Babylon, where the roads all once met. You're safe now. The journey's done, and the candle is low. Good night.